for tuning in to the Wingspace podcast. This podcast is not a replacement for mental health treatment or professional health care. In case of crisis or emergency, please contact your local healthcare provider or dial 911.
Hey there, and welcome to the Wingspace podcast, a place to take up space. Today we're going to chat a little bit about the history behind the first Thanksgiving and maybe a couple of lessons that we can learn to put into play as we move forward in celebrating Thanksgiving this year, as well as looking into the future.
Hey listeners, quick intermission with one of our providers at Hope and Healing, Kristen Wilson, LCSWC, who has started offering a new program at Hope and Healing for our couples called Prepare and Enrich. So Kristen, could you give us a little more information about that program?
Prepare and Enrich is a service that we'll be offering to premarital couples. It is a strength-based program that utilizes assessment portion and then subsequent sessions to look at that assessment and discuss what are your strengths, what are the areas of growth, what are conversations that you'd like to have as you are leading up to and preparing for marriage. One of the nice things about Prepare and Enrich is that it covers not only a wide variety of areas, but it can be utilized with couples that are in different stages of life as well. So maybe this is your first marriage. Maybe it is a blending of families that come into play when you are preparing for this. So the idea is that we can support you in that process and support you in having conversations with your partner and planning ahead for success.
And if someone is listening and is interested in seeking out this service for themselves and their partner, how could they go about inquiring or scheduling an appointment?
Contact us at Hope and Healing. You can go to the website and send us your information and we'll get back with you, or you can give us a call and we'll get you scheduled. There's more than one option when it comes to utilizing this program. This is a set group of sessions. So you will either be choosing to engage in 4 sessions or 8 sessions, depending on what your needs are, what your interests are, and what works for you. The assessment is part of both of those. The skill building, the recognizing our growth areas and working on those are included in both of those sets. So you will get that experience, but just the timing of it might look different depending on your needs.
Yes, so you can give us a call at 301-690-8404, extension 0. If you get the voicemail, make sure that you leave us one so that we can give you a call back within 24 hours. You can also visit our website, like Kristen mentioned, at hopehealingtherapy.com.
So there are some mixed stories about what the first Thanksgiving was. As kids, we had this storybook story that we learned about the Pilgrims and the Indians coming together, and it was harmonious and it was beautiful. And while there probably were some parts of it that were that, we have to remember that there was a lot of bloodshed between the settlers that came to the States in all parts of the shores and made their way into the inland parts of the U.S. and the Native American tribes that were here. We typically think of the first Thanksgiving as the celebration in Plymouth Rock. So I want to take you back to 1620. In September of 1620, the Mayflower left England and they were headed towards what we now know as Massachusetts, the Plymouth Rock area. I'm not a historian and I'm not a history buff. I really only passively pay attention when my husband watches it on TV, the History Channel. So thanks to thehistorychannel.com, I was able to grab some good information for today. So I will be honest, I don't know whether they were actually headed towards Plymouth or that just happened to be the piece of land that they hit first. But when they got there, when the Pilgrims got to Plymouth Rock, it was a brutal, brutal winter for them. And many of them didn't even get off the ship. They stayed on the ship. And so it wasn't until March, a couple of months, that they left the ship and they came ashore and they met and encountered several Native Americans. And the most popular that we know of is Squanto, who is a part of the Pawtuxet tribe. And he is credited to have taught the Pilgrims a lot about harvesting the land was different, what they could grow here was different, and he is credited for teaching them a lot about what they learned, and ultimately how we began to harvest food and gather things that were already naturally growing and things like that here. So, early 1620, they're trying to get through the first winter, and then they begin their harvest, and by November of 1621, so, they'd been here for almost they had left England a year before, and Squanto from the Pawtuxet tribe had taught them so much, and they had encountered also the Wampanoag tribe, and they celebrated their first harvest season in that November of 1621. There's one story you might read that part of their celebration was shooting off guns and cannons, and the local Indians came and were investigating what was happening, and so they ended up having this feast. There were other stories that say that it was more about sharing what the different harvests were, and so they had gathered together, and maybe it was somewhere in between the actual truth, but we know that according to history books, for 3 days they celebrated. Pilgrims that were there at Plymouth Rock and the Wampanoag tribe, they celebrated their harvest for 3 days. So that's what we know of as the first Thanksgiving. But it didn't become a tradition. So that first Thanksgiving, they likely were, one of the biggest things that they harvested was corn, potatoes. So their food was deer, waterfowl, probably seafood. They were right there in Massachusetts, probably lobster, corn, porridge, and they may have eaten pumpkins. They didn't eat them the way that we know of pumpkin pie now because they didn't have ways to bake, but certainly different puddings and cornmeal pudding with harvested fruits and nuts and things like that. So it looked a little different. They did have probably waterfowl, maybe some turkey, maybe not some turkey. But the meal that we know of today is not the meal that they had then. So the next Thanksgiving of record was 2 years later in 1623. There had been a very long, hard drought, and they celebrated with a feast because they were grateful and they were thankful for the drought ending and for them having a successful harvest in spite of that. So in 1623, there was another celebration that was a Thanksgiving of sorts. In 1789, so here we are, 70 years later, President Washington proclaimed the first Thanksgiving. And then it wasn't until 1817 that the states started to recognize it. So New York State was actually the first to adopt a holiday. And it looked a little different in different places. And for some southern states, they didn't even really know what it was all about because, word didn't travel the way that it travels now. And so people in the southern states didn't necessarily know what had happened in the northeastern part of the country. In 1863, it was declared that Thanksgiving Day would be the holiday on the last Thursday of the month. Now, it was moved up in 1939 by President Roosevelt as a way of sparking the economy and increase in sales, holiday sales during the Great Depression. And then finally, in 1941, it was marked as the fourth Thursday. So I guess I kind of take for granted that Thanksgiving has just always been a thing, but 1941 isn't really that long ago if we think about the Thanksgiving, the tradition, the holiday that we have, and that it wasn't always like that. We just kind of take for granted that things were just always that way. But really, 1621 was the first time that they gathered in Thanksgiving and coming together for a successful harvest and that celebration. And then in 1941 is when it was finally declared that the fourth Thursday of November would be considered Thanksgiving Day here in the US. And it's interesting that we sometimes take for granted what we have here in the US and we don't have in other places. Other countries don't celebrate Thanksgiving Day because that's not their tradition. They may have their own Thanksgiving Day, their own holiday at a different time, but they don't celebrate it the way that we do, at the time that we do. So while the first Thanksgiving looked different and was kind of at fluid times during the various years before it was designated as the fourth Thursday of the month, I believe there are 6 things that we can learn from the first Thanksgiving and put into place for all of our Thanksgivings this year and for the Thanksgivings to come. These are in no particular order. First one is to gather together and to be together and to be present. So when they were celebrating those successful harvests and celebrating a harvest after a drought, they were present. They were aware of the here and now. They weren't forward thinking. They weren't stressing about the past. They were grateful for what they had right here and right now. So they gathered together in spite of their differences. And they spent time together acknowledging the present, acknowledging what they had. So the very first thing that I would say is to be present and to be acutely aware of the next thing, which is the thankfulness and the gratitude you can have for the things that you have, no matter big or how small. Some people may say, well, I don't have much to be thankful for this year. And if you can, we've talked before about pulling in the blinders a little bit. And if you can look a little bit more narrow focused, you can see lots and lots of blessings around if you look at it from a mindset of gratitude. So being grateful and being thankful and acknowledging the people and the things that you are grateful for. Sometimes we have gratitude in our heart, but we don't say to those people around us how grateful we are for them. So I would encourage you to tell someone today that you're grateful for them. Keep a gratitude journal. Write down every day something you're grateful for. Every day, maybe send a text to someone or give a phone call or shoot an email, just saying how grateful you are for someone, to acknowledge gratitude and thankfulness. The other thing that we can learn in the course of gratitude is recognizing what we have of abundance and share that, whether it's our time or our talents, our energy, our wealth, our finances, but to share with others, having a heart of volunteerism and giving back, being able to give to others that we that might need more than what we have or need something that we have abundance of. So being willing to give back and to share, having compassion for others. Sometimes we judge other people for what they have or don't have, and we can set that judgment aside and be compassionate for each other, knowing that we don't necessarily know what everyone's circumstances are. We see what we see, but there's lots that goes on behind closed doors that we don't know about. And just being compassionate for other people, regardless of what we think we know. The last two can sometimes be the hardest, I think, because, we're in the midst of some pretty intense turmoil in Israel right now. And you can imagine that first Thanksgiving, you had the Pilgrims who encountered the Native American Indians. They were very, very different. They had very different cultures, they had very different practices, they had very different traditions, and yet they were able at times to find tolerance for each other, or at least to find tolerance for each other in order to gather together to be grateful for the harvest. Because it wasn't just the Pilgrims that had a successful harvest. It was also, the Native Americans would also have the ability to have that successful harvest that year. And 2 years later, when there had been a long drought, it wasn't just the Pilgrims who had a successful successful harvest in spite of that drought. It was also the Native Americans. So they had things to be grateful for in common, regardless of their differences and regardless of their different traditions. So the last two is to be able to be tolerant and accepting of other people and different practices and different traditions. Just because someone doesn't celebrate the way that we do doesn't mean that it's wrong. It just means that it's different, and maybe we can honor that and find ways to bring about peace even when we have differences. Being able to the quarrels, set aside the hurts in order to share the abundance that we have and to acknowledge and be grateful for all the things that we have. So, the first Thanksgiving that we, as we know it, looks very different than the Thanksgivings that we have now. Most people, I would say, probably have the traditional Thanksgiving with the ham and the turkey and the stuffing and the mashed potatoes and the gravy and the green beans and, pumpkin pie and apple pie and all those sorts of things. I know people who do a surf and turf meal. I know people who do an Italian meal. And maybe if you are from an Italian family, your Thanksgiving looks a little morphed in terms of, lots of traditional, as we think of Thanksgiving meals, or foods, but then there's also the lasagna and the spaghetti and whatever the family tradition is that comes from your genealogy. We all have those little twists and turns that we add in terms of the spices that we change, the spice that we add, not necessarily cooking spices, but just the changes and the little the nuances that we have. So even though our Thanksgivings now might not look like it did then, I would hope that maybe we could bring the spirit of that first Thanksgiving back into the Thanksgivings that we have now, and to be present, to be grateful, to share and to give back, to have compassion for others, and to find ways for peaceful tolerance of each other. I truly, truly wish each of you a wonderful Thanksgiving season. I hope that you are able to identify the things that you are grateful for and to carry that thankful spirit throughout the year, to not just be grateful and thankful now, but to be able to find, even in the dead of the winter or the heat of the summer, find ways and opportunities to be grateful and thankful for all that we have. So I wish each of you a very, very happy and blessed Thanksgiving. I would love to know what some of your traditions are for Thanksgiving and the upcoming holidays. Feel free to send us a DM, or you can always email me, Jennifer@hopehealingtherapy.com. Thanks for listening and have a great day.